the Dave Spencer, the one and only Dave Spencer. I'm not going to read this. I think I've read it too many times now, Dave. I'm going to let people look at that, and I'm going to tell them my experience with Dave. I think because it's a chat with Dave, and it's a slightly more informal session than your webinars that you usually do. So I've actually only had the pleasure of working with Dave for the last 6 months or so, but he has been doing this for 25 years, Dave, now.
Yeah, approximately. Yeah,
writing course books for 25 years, and is the writer of Gateway, the Gateway series, first edition, second edition, and now the fantastic new Gateway to the World, which was published and launched earlier this year. It's been a pleasure to work with Dave so far. I've got to say, an absolute pleasure to work with him. He's very generous with his time and with his mind, and very much looking forward to continuing to work with you, Dave, through all of this on the academic program. So yeah, I'm not going to read everything that you can see on the screen. I'll leave it there for a little bit while I hand over to Dave, which I think is about time. So over to you, everyone. Have a lovely chat, and I will see you in a little while.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for the kind words. Well, it's great to be with all of you guys today. And as Will has said, the idea is that this is a little bit informal, so it's more of a chat than a webinar presentation. I was asking for questions from everybody, particularly from my Gateway Facebook page. And by the way, if you follow my Gateway Facebook page, which I know that some of you do, there's a little surprise for you as well at the end. Actually, we also have another big surprise for you at the end for those people who would like to get more actively involved in the chat, but I'll explain more about that in the end. Hello, Nani. Yes, Nani is a loyal supporter, as is Isabel from Buenos Aires, but Nani from Mexico. Great to see you all, guys. A lot of people from Czech Republic today and from Slovakia, which is nice. So yeah, and we've got from all over the world, from Nepal, everywhere else. Let me explain how today is going to work. It's an informal chat. So what's going to happen? I've got some questions that people have already asked me, but at any moment in the session, if you have a question that you would like to ask me, just fire away, put it in the chat box. If I can, and if it's appropriate, I will try to answer it immediately within the session. And if not, at the end of this session, towards the end, we're going to have 15, 20 minutes where I'm going to answer the questions that you put in the chat box now. By the way, I must tell you, it's always amazing seeing so many places. There are so many places that I haven't been to yet, but there are so many places that I have been to, like Novosibirsk. I've never been to Vietnam, and I definitely want to go. So it's lovely. Now that we can't travel, it's amazing seeing so many places. Jordan, never been to Jordan, but would love to go. I'm going to start then with the first questions. By the way, I've sort of summarized your questions, so maybe you didn't write it exactly the same way. These two questions I've put together, okay, I thought this was a nice place to start talking about teaching teenagers. Lise, I don't know if Lise is here today, I hope so, but Lise, what are your top tips for novice teachers working with teens? And I thought I'd mix that also with what is your one top tip on classroom management, which was from Anastasia in Greece. And I'm not sure if Anastasia is here. Maybe you should just, yes, Anastasia, that's your question. Exactly. Okay. Right. Those two first questions, great questions. All of the questions were great. Top tips for novice teachers working with teens, and my top tip on classroom management. Well, the first question, this is easier said than done. But my advice is, even if you don't feel confident, try to look confident. Okay, so when you're teaching your first class with teens, I think that if you look as if you know what you're doing, you're going to have fewer problems. I think teenage students have a very quick reaction to teachers. Teenage students are always trying to test their teachers, to find out how far they'll go, to find out what they're like, to find out if they're going to be very disciplined, not very disciplined, some control, no control. And personally, there's an expression in English which people always argue about. One of the pieces of advice for new teachers is don't smile until Christmas. And of course, this always gets people quite angry because the idea is that if you don't smile, you're going to look serious, like you're in control, and that's going to help you. The problem is then that, of course, personally, I find it impossible not to smile. And I think that if you're in the classroom and you're enjoying being with the students, you are going to smile. And I think that's a good thing. But I think that the question is, don't smile until July. That's quite a long time. I suppose it depends when you start your year, right? But you get the idea. Don't smile until Christmas. Don't smile until July. Now, I think that's bad advice because I think teachers should smile as much as they feel like. But I think the message of that piece of advice is to be a little bit stricter at the beginning of the year. Because I do believe firmly that with teenagers, if, the expression in English, if you give them an inch, then they might take a mile. And I think it's easier if you start off a little bit stricter and then you gradually relax, okay? Whereas if you start off very friendly, very chummy, very pally, like you're one of their mates, then suddenly you realize after a week that they are in control and you are not in control. So basically, my advice there would be smile, yes, but be a little bit on your toes, be a little bit in control. The other piece of advice that I think, somebody agrees with me. Isabel agrees with me. Teens need to know who's in charge. And I believe that's true. Discipline is not a bad word, I think. Discipline is not a negative thing. Discipline is a good thing. When there's good discipline in a class, it means you can do more, the students can interact more, they can be more engaged, involved. But discipline is the structure, I think, that a class generally needs, especially, and maybe I should point this out now, there's a big difference between teaching 2 teenagers in a classroom and teaching 25 or 30 or more. And the bigger the group, the more important it is to keep some sort of control in the group. So my advice for a new teacher, be a little bit strict. Smile as much as you like, but be in control. Try to look like you know what you're doing and that you're in control. Other piece of advice, which I think is incredibly important when you begin teaching, is make sure you know what your school or what your institution, what your language academy expects. Because obviously you are part, if you teach private lessons on your own, you can decide. But if you teach for an institution, you need to know what are the things that you can tell your students to do and what are the things that you can't tell them to do. By the way, I love this. There are millions and millions of comments in the chat box, and I honestly wish I could spend my time reading them, but otherwise I can't continue the talk. So I'm just going to carry on. And as I say, afterwards, if anybody would like to interact more with me, that would be great. Anastasia's question was like my one top tip for any teacher, maybe an experienced teacher. And I think my one top tip for classroom management would actually be lesson planning. I firmly believe that when you plan your lesson more carefully, you're going to have a better lesson, fewer problems. Things happen spontaneously in a class, and that is a great thing. But I think if you've got a clear plan in your head of what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, why you're going to do it, then I think that everything is going to be much more successful. You might decide to abandon your plan at some moments, but having a plan before you go into the classroom, I think, is really essential. Hello, Monica. Hope you're well in the Canary Islands. So yeah, lesson planning. I think that's really important. I think the other thing that I would say is like the top tip of classroom management is literally being interested in your students. even if you've got a class of 20, 25, trying to, sort of have some sort of, even if it's a minimal personal relationship, but, if you know that your student, Ivan, plays football, then when you see him on Monday, how did you do at the weekend? Did you win? Did you not win? Just that small personal attention to the human being as opposed to just the students, I think really, really helps. Actually, this is an unofficial tip also, okay? But this is what I've learned over the many years. Some people might not like this, but in any class, there are some people who are leaders. And I think you all agree, right? In a large class of teenagers, some students are the leaders. Obviously, it's a good idea to sort of detect who those people are and try and win them over to your side. Because obviously, by getting 2 or 3 key students with you, then often I think you find that the whole class can be with you. So I'm not sure if that would appear in any book of classroom management, but I'm telling you that that's what I personally think sometimes works. Getting a few key people on your side so that they're with you, I think in the end also helps for classroom management. Asma is asking for warm-up activities, and I'm going to come on to warm-up activities very soon. Right, so I hope I've answered your questions, Lise and Anastasia. This is a really interesting question. What do you think about using the students' L1? And I believe that Julia is here, I hope, maybe. Maybe Julia didn't use the word forbid, okay? So that's probably my word, not her word. She sort of Julia asked the question, what do I think about students using L1 in the classroom? And it is true that some organizations are quite strict, like no, if you're in Spain, then no Spanish. If you're in Russia, don't use any Russian. What do I think about that? Well, the first thing I think about it is that if your school does forbid it, then don't do it, because I don't want you to lose your job. Okay, so that's my first piece of advice. If your school forbids it, try not to use L1. Apart from that, if it's like more the question, do I think it's a good idea or not? I think one of the questions is, it's very difficult to stop anybody using, speaking, or thinking in their L1, above all thinking. In other words, we can't deny that students have their own language. And when they learn another language like English, the same as if they were learning Italian, I'm sure that in their heads, they are continually thinking, okay, well, that's the way that we do it in Russian, but this is the way we do it in English. You can't stop that happening. I do think that there's a problem, particularly with teenagers, that if we are not careful, if we start doing a little bit of L1, suddenly we realize a month later that everything is in L1. And so one little trick that I have is trying to use as little L1, students L1 as possible. So for example, let's imagine that I've done a grammar explanation and I think my grammar explanation was clear, but I want to check. Then instead of me using any Spanish, for example, in my case, what I sometimes do is I ask one of the students to explain what they think I have just said in their language. In that case, we're checking very clearly, very well, how clear my explanation was. And at the same time, I'm showing that I am going to use as little L1 as possible. So in other words, by using the students occasionally to sort of interpret, if you like, then I think that that can help to not slide into too much use of L1. Obviously, I think also it's a question of level, isn't it? I think at a low level, a certain amount of the students using their own language is normal. And I think that some students we can really make unhappy by forcing them continually to do everything in L1. Maybe we're going to cause a little bit of trauma, a little bit of a little bit of embarrassment to the students if we obsessively demand that everything they do is in L1. And obviously there are certain things that students feel frustrated because they cannot explain in their own language. So So, in other words, I would say that, first of all, we can't really stop students thinking and wanting to use L1. I think we can try and encourage them to use as much L2 as possible, and that is a good idea. But being, I would say, lenient by being flexible, I think would be the key. But as I said before, if your school really demands always L1, then what am I? I can't really do anything about that. Now, I've already seen, and this is interesting, I've already seen some questions, and I know that Nanny's here today. I've seen questions about getting teenagers to speak when they don't want to, okay? And I think, I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way, right? How do you get to do that? You know, how do you get around that problem? So Nanny's question was, how do you combat I don't know as a way of avoiding saying anything in conversational lessons? How can you motivate teens when they think English is useful for them? And what can I do when students don't want to take part in competitions, public speaking activities, and debate? Which is a question from Natia from Georgia. Are you here, Natia or Lyudmila? If you are, then join you now. Just say hello now. Those questions, I think they're all key questions, right, for teaching teenagers. And there are lots of different questions about this, and I'm going to go for like Nanny's question about, hello Nadia, good to see you. Nanny's question, so let's imagine that you're trying to do a conversation class and you ask a question and your students say, I don't know. And that's all they say, okay? Right, I think there are lots of different questions here. First question is, why are they saying, I don't know? So you ask any question, they say, I don't know. Now it could be that they feel shy, okay? And I always feel strongly about this because when I was a teenage student, I was very shy and I loved learning French and Spanish, but I was the quietest person in the class. So maybe one reason why teenage students are saying, I don't know, is because they feel shy and they don't want to speak in public. If that's the question, then obviously we're going to have to be sensitive. We're going to have to encourage students. We're going to maybe I'm going to talk about two things in this answer: carrots and sticks. Okay, I don't know if you know that expression, but carrots like encouraging them, and a stick sometimes to force people to do something. You could give them a carrot, which is that, you know, for having a go, you're going to give them some sort of positive mark. You're going to give them a mark for having a go. Maybe they don't do it very well, but they have a go. There's a great quotation. The biggest mistake when speaking is concerned is not speaking at all. And you could maybe point that out to students. I point that out to some of my students. The biggest mistake ever with speaking is not speaking, because if you don't speak, you'll never get better. So shyness could be one thing. So let's be encouraging. Let's try and increase their self-confidence, and let's correct very positively. The next question, the next reason why they say, I don't know, could be because they genuinely do not know. So maybe when they say, you know, what do you think we should do in this situation? And they say, I don't know, maybe they don't know. Now, if that's the case, then we need to encourage them to think. And if you've seen my new book, Gateway to the World, I'm teaching thinking skills precisely for that reason, to help to generate ideas and opinions with our teenage students, because sometimes they don't quite know what to say. So, you know, maybe we need to encourage them there to give them ideas. The next reason why a teenage student might just say, I don't know, is because they haven't got the English. Yeah. So maybe they can't do it in English. Maybe they could do it in their L1, but they can't do it in English. So let's check with any speaking activity that the students genuinely have the language that they need to be able to answer the question. Okay. So let's check they've got the English. Somebody's just mentioned something which I think I'm just going to say now, which is maybe they are literally not interested in what you're talking about. Okay, so maybe they say, I don't know, because they just don't care. They have no interest. I think with that question, there are two problems. There are two things. We could say, okay, I'm going to try and find something that interests them. But as I think somebody also has mentioned in the chat box, that some teenage students will say that nothing interests them. In that case, if they're going to say that they're not interested in anything, I just force them to have an opinion. So I will not take I don't know as an answer just because they're not interested in the topic. In an exam, in a Cambridge exam, in a school leaving exam, they cannot choose the question that they answer. So in my class, if I ask them that question, then I'm going to force them to answer that question. In that case, that's a little bit the question of the stick as opposed to the carrot, a metaphoric stick, as it were. And another reason is that students might say, I don't know, and not do anything, as I think it was Natia maybe saying, they just don't want to do it. In that case, then I think we have to force them in a way to sort of see the point. Why are we doing this? One of the reasons we're doing this is that because spoken English is one of the most important things when they're trying to find a job, for example. Spoken English is often one of the most important things when students do an exam in English. So we need them to realize that, that speaking English is simply another part, and also another part of their course, which is evaluated. And again, if you like, the stick is that, I do make it clear when students do a speaking activity in pairs, the person who doesn't contribute is going to get a lovely big X. Okay. And if they have a go, and even if they have a go and make lots of mistakes, even if they have a go and mix maybe some English and some Spanish, I'm also going to give them a positive mark. So, in other words, there are lots of different questions why teenage students don't want to speak. By the way, I have a webinar which you can find on YouTube. If you just Google Dave Spencer, to speak or not to speak. Okay, I'll repeat that. It's very Shakespearean. To speak or not to speak, David Spencer, and there's a whole 50-minute webinar talking about that question, about how to get teenage students to speak and why often they don't speak in class. And Lyudmila, who I saw before, said hello. A lovely big X means like a cross. It's like saying that was not satisfactory. Okay. As I say, as a teacher of teenagers, I have large classes of teenagers. Their English is an evaluable subject, the same as chemistry, the same as history, the same as economics. Then I make it clear to my students that the evaluation also includes speaking. I think students sometimes think that evaluation of English is only grammar and vocabulary. But of course, evaluation of English should also be speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Yeah. Now, Lyudmila mentioned, how can you motivate teens when they think English is useless for them? And I'm just going to show you a little diagram. This is from the Washington Post. And this diagram shows that English is by far the most common studied foreign language in the world. In other words, English is not useful to speak to English people. Maybe your students will never meet an English person. Maybe they will never meet an American speaker. But even if they're learning English in Russia, they might well meet students who the only other language they can speak is English. And you could be in Slovakia and the same thing will happen. And in Jordan, the same thing will happen. Wherever you are in the world, English is used as a lingua franca because so many people are learning it around the world. 1.5 billion learners. So if you don't want to learn English, it's pretty difficult to avoid English. I don't like maybe maths, but there are times when I can't avoid maths in my daily life. English is the same. You can't avoid English around the world. So we've got, for example, 82 million people learning French, which is a lot of people, 82 million. But we're talking about 1.5 billion learners of English. By the way, in Gateway to the World, one of the reasons why it's called Gateway to the World is because we have these collaborative projects where students will be able to share their projects with students from any country around the world that is using Gateway to the World. So in our way, we're trying to help with this problem so that English is a lingua franca for our own students. If they want to compare sports in Georgia with sports in Mexico, by using the virtual classroom exchange, we're going to be able to do that. Your students are going to be able to interchange projects. That's going to be that. So Elena, that is in Gateway to the World. We'll try and explain it, but basically, if you're using Gateway to the World, there will be a channel for students to do this, okay? The other thing, which is really interesting, I think this is from a British Council survey. English is now not only like the international language of business, which of course for teenage students is not so interesting. English is the international language of entertainment. So I think it's saying there that 43% of Spanish students in Madrid are playing games in English. Okay, 23% are using English for social networks. 23% are using it for the internet and television and films. So those statistics I think are really interesting. English is an international language of entertainment. And, I think that's a great thing for our students to realize. Often, to be honest, I remember being in Georgia and meeting a 10-year-old boy whose English was absolutely outstanding. And it was because he spent so much time watching Cartoon Network. I mean, he spoke with an American accent, just incredible. So, English is becoming part of teenagers' lives because of this global impact of internet and online teaching. Online communication, entertainment. Okay, and my last point, this is my favorite quotation I think about teaching, and it helps me to philosophically suffer the stress of being a teacher of teenagers. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. At its simplest, schools gives young people a place at the water's edge. A horse may not choose to drink if it is led to water, but it cannot drink at all if the water is not there. In other words, part of our job as teenage teachers is to try and get our students to do things, and maybe they refuse. Maybe they refuse to drink. Maybe they refuse to pay any attention to us. At the end of the day, we have still tried to do our job. The important thing is not to give up, to keep on trying. And, sometimes we get better results than we think. We need to be resilient as teachers. Okay, cool. The next question, Nadia, here was another question. And Nadia was asking a few questions about online teaching. Okay, so increasing students' talking time, dealing with problems of engagement, and coping with technical difficulties. Coping with technical difficulties, I would say the first thing that I try and do is keep everything as simple as possible. So I do try and avoid overcomplicating things. And I think that for me is point number one. Point number two is there are so many technical difficulties that are beyond our control. And I think as teachers, we have a hard time teaching online, but if we start beating ourselves around the head because of technical difficulties, then we're going to be in trouble. I think you can note them down. You can maybe mention the problems. If a student has problems connecting, you can mention it to your bosses, to your management, to your directors. But, there are so many things that are out of our control. So I think we have to take it philosophically and calmly. The thing about dealing with problems of engagement, I think, is a little bit similar to a class in the classroom. One little thing that I do, because by the way, I don't consider that I am the best online teacher in the world. In fact, I've spent a lot of time now teaching mask to mask instead of teaching online. But one thing when I teach online is that I have a class list in front of me, and I actually tick all the time when students are interacting and when they are engaging. And I keep that because I find it really useful. When a student answers one of my questions, when a student asks a question, when a student is involved in the learning process, I'm literally looking at my list and ticking. And I look down at my list and I try and see if there is somebody who hasn't really said anything to me, who hasn't said anything to the rest of the class. And in that case, I try and ask that student in particular, that student to answer a question. Yeah, Lucia. Nobody taught me that. I simply discovered that for myself, that it's just a simple thing. But I every time I teach online, I have my list in front of me. Maybe I want to write down something. Maybe I need to write down, some problem that a student has. But a list, I find like really, really useful. And I've been going backwards. The last question there, how to increase students' talking time. Of course, I'm sure everybody is using breakout rooms, I would imagine. And, breakout rooms, it feels like breakout rooms were designed specifically for teachers of English, right? Because they're such a useful thing for us. And by the way, so a little surprise for you guys is that at the end of this session, anybody who would like to carry on the discussion, we're going to be doing breakout rooms today here with you guys. So if any of you want to stay around, we're going to be going into breakout rooms. You don't have to stay. So if you do prefer to leave, that's fine. But anybody who would like to stay today, we're going to be doing breakout rooms, and I'll be trying to pop in and say hello to you. So that's going to be a little experiment today, okay? It's quite exciting. I hope you enjoy that. Next question. Should you use meta-language when correcting writing? And I don't know if you pronounce your name Araelena or Araelena. Are you here? You can maybe tell me later in a breakout room how to pronounce your name. I'm going to pronounce it Araelena, but I might be wrong. Right, okay. Should you use meta-language when correcting writing? Okay, well, I'm going to say something that not everybody maybe will agree with me, but I am actually a fan of meta-language with teenagers. And I tell you, with teenagers, I think primary students are too young to respond to meta-language. Meta-language, of course, is language we use to talk about language. So when we say the present perfect, when we say past participle, maybe when we talk about clauses, okay, that is meta-language. With teenagers, they're doing far more complicated things usually when they analyze their own language. So I think many teenage students are happy using meta-language because they use that meta-language to describe their own language when they're studying that at school. I think it's a good idea because I think it's like calling something by its name. I think it's a shortcut. I think it gets to the point. What you have to do is make sure you grade your meta-language carefully. Okay, so if you think your students won't know this meta-language, then teach it. Or say something simpler. But personally, I think meta-language is a good thing. Michael Swan, I'm sure you all know Michael Swan, he always says teaching grammar is a shortcut. Maybe again, it's different if your students are learning English in England. Maybe they need less grammar. They can pick things up. But when we're teaching 3 hours a week in Albania or in Slovakia or wherever we're teaching, 3 hours a week is not much. Teaching grammar, meta-language, I think saves us time. And when I'm correcting writing, then I do think it's a quite good idea to actually use some meta-language to explain, this clause goes at the beginning or goes at the end. Just check that the students understand it. Of course, there is a different question here, which is that when we correct writing, we shouldn't only be correcting grammar. And we shouldn't only even be correcting language. We should be correcting coherence. We should be correcting ideas. We should be correcting the content. We should also be responding on a personal level of whether they've done something better than last time, less good than last time. So in other words, I would say, yes, you can use meta-language as long as you think the students know it. If they don't know it, teach it to them. And apart from that, let's never forget that we also need to correct other things, not just the grammar, for example, not just maybe even paragraphs, but more the actual content. Yeah, and Marina, I think, is saying that you should do it gradually. Definitely. Gradually according to the level and gradually according to the age. And as I said before, I'm talking particularly teenagers. Primary students, I think, are a little bit young, unless you're doing very simple meta-language. And adult students, maybe who are coming in the evening at the end of a day's work, maybe find it a little bit tedious maybe to talk about some of that meta language, so maybe you might use less. But personally with teenagers, I'm very happy to teach some meta language gradually. As always, you're free to disagree with me if you feel like disagreeing. It's definitely a good idea to sometimes disagree too. Okay, another good question. Is it a good idea to explain all new words from a reading or listening text? This question was from Marietta. Thank you again for all you people who sent these great questions last week or the week before. Is it a good idea to explain all new words from a reading or listening text? Well, Marietta, I would say definitely no. No, not really. Of course, one of the questions there is how many words are new? I mean, if there are lots and lots and lots of new words in the reading text or listening text, then probably the text is the wrong level. So maybe you need to rethink the level of the text that you're using with your students. If it's one or two keywords that you think the students have to understand in order to understand the gist and the main ideas of the text, then yes, teach those couple of words, those 2-3 words which you think are key. Maybe also at the end of the reading text, you think there are a few words that were useful that have appeared in the text, and you might want to point them out and explain them to your students. There is also a difference in English, I think you probably know, between teaching vocabulary for active use and for passive use. When we teach like different types of transport at B1, B1+, we want to teach those words so the students remember them and use them throughout, for example, the unit and the next unit. If you're doing a text and a word appears that you think is quite interesting to teach, the students might just need to know it passively. They need to understand it, but you don't expect them to use it. Actually, yesterday, strangely, in a text, the word spell came up. It was for 16, 17-year-olds at B2, spell. And the word was spell. So he went for a spell to Italy. Okay, a spell. So we think of spell as spelling. We think of spell as maybe what a witch or a wizard does. But this was a spell like a short period. And my students found the word interesting, and I explained it to them, but I don't really want them to use spell. If they remember it, great. But if they don't remember it, that doesn't worry me. I'm not teaching the word for active use. What we do need to do with reading and listening is to make sure that our students realize that the important thing is to understand the main message, not every word. If they think they need to understand every word, they will give up on any text. They will give up when they search online for something. They will, they'll start to panic. And reading is not about understanding every word. Reading is about understanding the main message. Okay, I hope I've answered your question, Marietta, if Marietta is here. Let's see, what's my next question? Oh, yes. Okay, right. We're going to get on to some activities in a second. How do you revise vocabulary, collocations, and phrasal verbs in class? And this was combining two people's question. So it's a combination of Nino's question and Ina's question. I think it was probably Nino who mentioned vocabulary, collocations, and phrasal verbs. And I liked that immediately because I revise vocabulary, collocations, and phrasal verbs in exactly the same way, because for me, they are all the same. So collocations I would revise and phrasal verbs I would revise in the same way as any vocabulary. Okay, Ina, I've noticed that Ina is here. Yeah, great. I'm glad that you're here. Now, my secret for vocabulary teaching is this. I've sometimes shown this maybe, okay? This was from 2016. I keep them forever and ever. In every class, what I do is I have these pieces of paper, and every new word that I want my students to remember, I write it down on a little piece of paper. So this is the end of the year. Okay, so these are the words that my students learned in 1 year. I hope they learned them. And it's actually very nice because it's very physical, right? You can actually see, you can see what they learned. Every time I present some new vocabulary, whether it is a phrasal verb, whether it's a collocation, whether it's a dependent preposition, or whether it's just a single word, I write them down here, okay? And with these pieces of paper, I do my revision exercises. So revision, somebody's saying, what do I mean by revise, or what do we mean by revise? I think we're just saying, yeah, recycling vocabulary so that students remember them. Now, one reason why I write these words down is because can you really remember exactly all of the words that you taught your students in one particular class in October or in November? Unless you write them down, I'm not sure that you will remember them. The great thing about this is that all of the words are together from the very first day of class until the very latest day of class. And the other great thing is that we teach vocabulary in groups, in units, but with these cards, we mix them all together. So they're all together. So next to the word that I taught in September might be next to a phrasal verb I taught them last week. Okay, so the great thing about this is that I have this in the classroom, and anytime I want to do a little activity, a little game, then I know exactly which words I can use. How do we revise them? Maybe one of the first things that I do is I simply go into class and I pick a word and I say, okay, so how do you say whatever in English? Or maybe I define a word and they have to say what it is. Okay, I'm going to define, this is an advanced group, okay? And this is difficult because you are not my class. Let's see if you get this or not. Bonus points for anybody who can give me the correct answer as quickly as possible. But it is a phrasal verb, which means to explode. To explode or to start ringing, for example. Yeah, oh, that was too fast. Okay, it was go off. Actually, blow up you could also use as well, yeah? I think we saw it, so I can't remember a text we used, but that phrasal verb appeared. So at the beginning of here's another one. Should we do another one? I feel like playing a game with you now. This is an expression which is typical when a parent says to a child, you can't go out tonight because you are what? What's the word? You are... Yes, exactly. Marietta, maybe? It's going so fast. You're grounded. Okay. Right. This is an advanced group. Okay. So advanced vocabulary. I've got all of these cards and I can play games all day long because I know exactly which words I want to recycle. Okay. So for me, this is key. I keep all of these words together. I have them in my class every day. I could play games like Pictionary. You know, I mean, I'm sure we all know Pictionary. I'm sure we all know Lockdown. Lockdown, it could be Lockdown. It was Grounded. We can play these games. We can play Hangman. We can play Pictionary. We can play any game that we like, okay? So that is key for me. That is exactly how I revise vocabulary. Actually, I'm going to go back for a second. Another game that I like doing is doing the opposite of that. I get my students to test me. With vocabulary. How long each lesson? Well, I think these activities are perfect, for example, for 5 minutes at the beginning of the lesson, 5 minutes at the end of the lesson, for example. And obviously, the more you do these activities, the more vocabulary your students will remember. But sometimes I get my students to test me. So they define a word. By the way, you can use this using the vocabulary list at the end of the unit in your coursebook, like Gateway. Get the students to choose a word. Each student chooses one word. They define the word to me, and I have to say what it is. It looks like they are testing me, but of course, I'm testing them, because if they can define the word, then they understand the word. Another favorite activity of mine, and we're going to play this now, so get ready in the chat box to write some words down. I call it like how many words in a minute. I give my students 60 seconds to type down as many words in a category. We're going to do it now in the chat box. Okay, get ready to write. I want you to write down as quickly as possible anything in the world that is usually the color yellow. Anything that is usually typically yellow. The sun, no repetition, no repetition, no repetition. No more bananas. Peppers, yellow peppers, that's true. Sunflower is nice. Yeah, dandelion is nice. I like dandelion. Cabs, yeah, we're going to see a yellow cab in a minute. Okay, daffodils, butter. Yeah, excellent. Okay, great. That is brilliant. You can do all sorts of categories. You could do sports that don't need a ball. You could do adjectives that describe feelings. Millions of things, okay? Millions of things. Now, my next question, we could play all day, okay? We are going to play another game in a second, okay? If you want to keep on writing yellow things, that's fine with me. Just carry on if you like. Next question, what are my top 3 warm-up activities and what grammar games do your students enjoy? My favorite warm-up activities are ones that don't really need any materials that I can do without anything. One of them is simply a word chain. I love this activity. It's so simple and it wakes my students up. So you simply say a word and the students in order around the class, maybe following your class list again if you're teaching online, each student has to give me a word connected with the last word that I said. So if I say tree, you would say, for example, bird. Yeah, bird would be good. If the student number 1 says bird, then you have to think of a word connected with bird. If you said bird, then you might say, somebody's just put nest. Somebody might put feather. If you say feather, then the next word could be light. And you go round as a chain. And I love this activity because when students have just come from their chemistry class, they're not thinking in English. Their brains are not active in English. And I love this activity. Also, I love this activity at 8:30 in the morning because my students are half asleep. So they go very slowly the first time, and then I tell them that the next activity, they have to do it faster. So it's actually quite nice to time them. So if it takes like 3 minutes to do all around the class the first time, I say, okay, your mission is to make sure we can do it again, but faster than 3 minutes. So very simple way to encourage students to wake up in English. Now, in terms of grammar, this is one of my favorite activities. I've shown this on the Gateway Facebook page before. By the way, you can feel free to join the Gateway Facebook page at the end of this session. This is just a nice activity to do with a grid, okay? You got lots of different words, and you can see that here I was practicing verbs of modal verbs of obligation, prohibition, advice. And I was revising them in the present and the past. So I'm sure you can do this quite easily, but could you, can anybody make a sentence? You can't use any word apart from the words here. Well, that's very nice, Karina. You're great. Thank you. That's very nice. Can anybody make a sentence using words here? I know it takes a short while, yeah, to think. You had it done. That's interesting. Yeah, you had it done. You should have done it. You should speak. You needn't do it. Right now, this activity I like because it's a game, but it's a way of tricking the students to pay more attention to accuracy. The students get a point for each sentence they can make, but only if the sentence is grammatically correct. And of course, I did this game because my students were making lots of mistakes. They were saying things you needn't to do it. Okay, which is obviously incorrect. You shouldn't to do it. You should had, okay? So this is a simple way to get students to concentrate on accuracy and to pay attention to accuracy, which often teenage students don't like paying attention to accuracy. So it's a game, but it gets students to pay attention. Okay, I'm conscious that my time is sort of semi-running out. I've got a few last questions, I think, and then maybe we've got time for some of your questions here. I think we're going to have to do another question and answer session one day, because I can see there are so many questions here. Somebody asked about Gateway to the World. Elena, is Gateway to the World aimed at exam preparation? Yes, it is, okay, but not exclusively. So I always say with Gateway, we try to avoid exam tunnel vision. Sometimes we get so obsessed with an exam, we never do anything apart from exam practice. And I think that's a pity for our teenage students. I think if our students are always looking only at exams, they're missing many other things. That's why if you know Gateway, you know that we also teach life skills. In Gateway to the World, we now teach thinking skills. We teach social and emotional learning. In other words, for me, when we're teaching teenagers, we should be teaching for exams like Cambridge exams, like school leaving exams, like university entrance exams, but not only. So if it's possible, we try and teach grammar exercises. We also teach a wide variety of exam type exercises, not just 2 or 3. I think the problem with exams is the exam tasks are repetitive. They do the same task again and again and again. They know the strategy. It just gets boring because they're doing it all the time. So in my opinion, I think it's good if the students can do exam preparation with other things. Actually, can I just remember, while I'm thinking about Gateway to the World, I suddenly saw this and I suddenly realized that when I talked about vocabulary revision, I forgot to tell you that I'm sure lots of you use Kahoot, right? Did you know that Gateway to the World has Kahoot games in it? Okay, so you're going to be able to recycle grammar and vocabulary in Gateway to the World using Kahoot. I suddenly saw that picture and I remembered that I forgot to answer that question, or I forgot to tell you that bit of news. I think these are the last 2 questions. Apart from your questions now, what topics are appealing for exam preparation for teens, and how do you choose topics and videos for your course books? Great questions. Okay, great questions. I have a theory, which is that any topic in the world can be extremely interesting or extremely boring. I don't think it's the topic that is interesting or boring. I think it's the way that you deal with the topic. It's the way that you approach the topic. So for me, I think you could have a really interesting text about, I don't know, crosswords. I think you could have a really interesting text about chess. You could have a really interesting text about stamps, probably, if you find an interesting angle. And that's basically the way that I try and choose my topics and texts in Gateway to the World. I just find if it's interesting to me, then I try it out with other people. I try it out with my students. My editors also look at them. And if people find something a little bit interesting, they learn something by reading the text, then that for me is the key. Of course, you probably realize, but actually choosing a text is not the difficult thing. It's one of the difficult things about writing a course book, but the other difficult things are then making the text present and practice the grammar that you want it to practice and present, that it presents the vocabulary you want to incorporate, and that it includes the exam task or the comprehension task that you want it to incorporate. So the important thing really is getting the task to the text to incorporate all the things that you want to teach. It isn't just a text, it's a presentation tool also in Gateway. Okay, this is not the end of the session, but it's the end of that little block. Will is going to come back, I think, in a second to maybe put some of your questions to me. I just wanted to show you, actually, at the back of any course book, the most important thing for any writer is the acknowledgement. It's thanking your family and your friends and all the people that have worked with you. And I just wanted to point out to all of those people who follow the Gateway Facebook page, people like Monica and Isabel and Nanny, that you are in fact in the back of my book. I've never told you this before, but you're all at the back of my book because it says there, David Spencer would like to thank, and then it says all the many teachers from near and afar who have kept me company on the Gateway Facebook page during the whole time I was writing these books. So I couldn't name everybody, but that is really to you, because when you're writing a book, it's a very lonely experience, but I've always appreciated the contact that I've had with all of you guys who are following the Gateway Facebook page. So you are in my book.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave. Can you see and hear me okay?
I can, perfectly, yeah.
Good stuff. Oh, that was brilliant, Dave. It was absolutely brilliant. Such a lovely session. So personal, I think it was. It was really nice to see the people that have asked these questions and benefit from the answers. Absolutely brilliant. Thanks so much, Dave.
I'm just worried now that people have questions that I can't answer, but of course people can also contact me at the Facebook Teach with Dave, the Teach with Dave Facebook page.
Yeah, for sure. Let me just put that link up here. I've got it here ready. That's the link. There you go. You can see it in the chat box. There it is, hopefully. So yes, Dave, we've had quite a few questions throughout, so I'm going to crack straight on with that. One really interesting question, actually, I'd like to ask you first, was you were talking about meta-language a little while ago, and you say sometimes you do use meta-language. But when you don't use meta-language, what do you do? How can you replace meta-language? Really nice question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And you know what? I suspect that many people replace meta-language with L1. Because when you can't actually use that language, sometimes people use maybe the meta language in L1. So I would prefer personally to use meta language in English. It is interesting. I know one very important country that uses a special version of my books, but they translate all of the meta language into their language. It's actually Poland. And I find that interesting because, if you teach meta language at B1 level, by the time that you get to B2, B2+, you don't need to translate that language anymore because the students are used to using it. So, obviously, it is a good question. I mean, there are certain things. How do you explain the past participle? Actually, I know some people describe the past participle as the third column.
Verb 3. Yeah, just verb 3.
I mean, for me, the third column, I prefer students to say the past participle because
really,
the third column is what's that? I mean, what is it's not very clear to understand. I think so. They are. Again, teenage students, they are students, they're learning chemistry, they're learning like very complicated language when they describe chemical processes, when they describe maths, Why can't they use serious language to describe language, Funnily enough, I learned the expression gerund and infinitive only because I studied Latin at school. I mean, in English, when I was a kid, we never used any meta language, but it was actually by learning Latin that I learnt it, and it has been useful to, for me, for my career, as it were. But I think that I would prefer people to call it the present participle. Present participle.
Present participle for the verbing form. Yeah.
Yeah, but whatever works, I mean, I'm not dogmatic either, whatever you think works, but basically I'm saying that I'm not against it. Some people sort of seem to think that it's too abstract, too serious, but I think students do a lot more complex things in other subjects. So I don't think it's a problem in English.
Right. Perhaps it's a good idea to do both. I used to teach at a private language school, and people from all sorts of different English language learning backgrounds, and I often find saying past participle, verb 3, the present perfect verb, however they might associate.
Exactly. What is also true, and I am very aware of this, is that some students, respond to that kind of teaching better than others. But as always, some students might find the meta language confusing, but they can use the language well. If they can use it well, great. I don't care. If they can do it well and they don't need the meta language, that's great. And some people might find the meta language confusing. On the other hand, some people might find it really useful, really helpful. I think I said before, a shortcut. I think meta language is a shortcut. The same as teaching grammar is a shortcut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Dave. Okay, so a question from Anastasia. I think this might be another question from Anastasia, maybe the same one from your presentation. So she said, a lot of my students, this is a bit of a preamble, a lot of my students are still sure that firstly, they'll never need English for work, and secondly, there's no need to study English for traveling, as people in Turkey, Thailand, etc. can speak Russian. I'm still trying to find something else to motivate them. Do you have any ideas?
Well, I mean, I think actually this was also connected with Lyudmila's question. She said something similar about teaching in a vocational school, and then she mentioned something. But I am a big fan of game-like activities. Of getting engagement by doing game-like activities. Like I said before, sometimes we trick students into doing something. They don't realize that they're doing serious work, but they are. I say game-like because sometimes we think a game is literally playing, but of course if you're playing with English, then some English is happening. I know that I think it was Lyudmila herself who said, like, well, it doesn't lead to much. I think it leads to something, and I think if we're talking about a really difficult teaching situation where the students are unmotivated, then if they enjoy doing a few games at least in English, then I'm happy. Whether it's like the vocabulary game before that I said. But I think that game-like activities can get the students onto our side, and then once they're a bit more with us, a bit more positively engaged, then maybe we can add on more serious work at the same time. Actually, I have one little story. I don't know how long I can carry on talking, but this is a quick story.
A few minutes, Dave. Go ahead. Why not?
One of my ex-students, he was a bad student. He was not academically very good. He wanted to leave school. He left school earlier. So he left school at 16, not 18, which is rare in my school. He left and I didn't see him for a while. His name was Charlie. One day I was walking around my local DIY store and somebody shouted out, "Dave, Dave," and it was Charlie. And Charlie came up to me and he said, like, "I wish I'd paid more attention to you when I was at school, because like there are lots of customers who suddenly appear who speak in English and I don't know any English to reply to them." And like I said before, I think that English is it's just around so much that, you can't really escape it. So, Anastasia's students are obviously a pretty difficult maybe a difficult class, a difficult situation, but maybe between games and trying to persuade them, that one day, wherever they're working, wherever they may end up working, they may need it.
Yeah, right.
And if not, then my quotation about leading a horse to water is totally relevant.
Okay, so probably time for one more, if that's all right, Dave. We have had quite a few. Maybe we're going to have to do this again. There have been so many questions.
I'm happy.
Great. So last one from Al's Better is, could you please, Dave, give us some tips in case the teacher-students feel they're sort of stagnating? It happens, for example, sometime after achieving intermediate level, present perfect, etc. It's very different from the beginner's level, where progress is obviously a lot more visible and clear when you're getting better. Any advice for that sort of period?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to my vocabulary thing, because I know exactly, the between intermediate, upper intermediate, and then advanced, there are like those moments where you feel like you're not going anywhere. And I think that vocabulary for me is key there, because, the problem with many students is that for good reasons, grammar syllabuses, they go round and round in a circle. So you do comparatives and superlatives at A2, but then you do them again at B1, slightly more difficult. Then you do them again at B2 and then B2 plus, and you keep on doing them. So students think they know all of the grammar. Maybe they still get it wrong, and maybe there are more subtle, more complicated things to teach them. But grammar then, I think, is difficult to convince students that, that they're making progress. I think vocabulary is something where there are always more words to learn, And as I said before, with my vocabulary cards, they're very visible. So it's almost like saying, after a term, this is new, this is all new. This is what we've done. So for me, vocabulary teaching, vocabulary recycling. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention that I've got a webinar. I think it's called Word Perfect, that if you're interested in vocabulary teaching, you might like to see. Again, it'll be on YouTube, David Spencer, Word Perfect. But, vocabulary teaching for me is the key to helping. Again, I think, for example, between B2 and B2 plus, students feel like they've done it all. And vocabulary is one area where we can help them. I think also this idea, which I do a lot, of sort of keeping the students' work from the beginning of the year, then showing it to them at the middle of the year and at the end of the year. I think it's quite useful for students to realize that. I think students don't realize sometimes the progress that they're making. Sometimes, we forget that they can't see it. So I think one thing that I try and do is to help them to see the progress that they've made. And if you can even keep things like recordings of a student from the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year, maybe doing the same task and just seeing how they can do it better.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. So I've got one more question for myself, I think, to finish it off, if you don't mind, Dave.
Sure.
If you could give one piece of advice, if you could only give one piece of advice to a teacher of teens, what would that advice be?
I suppose it would be something like try and enjoy it. Because I think that if you don't enjoy it, then, nothing's going to happen. Somebody was asking me about motivation recently. If when you walk into the classroom, you're looking like you don't enjoy it, you're looking like that you don't want to be there, then so I think I think I always feel sorry for teachers who have to teach some primary, some secondary, some adults, which happens to many people. I think it's always nice to feel like where you are in teaching is where you want to be and where you enjoy being. Personally, I found that teenagers is where I enjoy teaching. So yeah, if you enjoy what you're doing, then usually the rest more or less takes care of itself. The fact that so many of us have had a hard time teaching online, we stick at it because we enjoy still having that connection with our students however we can. So if you can still remind yourself that you're doing it because you enjoy it and you like seeing the progress that the teacher that you mentioned before, when you realize that your students are making progress, you just feel like you're doing something useful. So maybe that's the one.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Dave. Great advice. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, so before we move on, because it's not over yet, we're not finished. We ain't finished just yet. I've just got to dedicate a moment to tell you about Dave's course that I'm sure all of you are familiar with now. Gateway to the World. It's been Dave's, as he's told me, his absolute pleasure writing this course, the third edition to his Gateway series. And it's absolutely brilliant. It's got everything that we know that he knows that you love about the Gateway series, and then some. So it's got all that trusted methodology that you know and love about Gateway, and of course written by the fantastic David Spencer using his first-hand experience in the classroom. Dave, do you want to just tell them a little bit, because we've had the question twice now, about the main differences between this and the second edition?
Yeah, that is a good question. And by the way, while I remember, particularly teachers in Russia, just to tell you, you might know, but on the 1st of April, I will be explaining the book in detail. And I think, in fact, if you're not in Russia, you can also come along, okay? So I'm not sure if we've got a link for that, Will, but otherwise...
Federica, would you mind getting a link for that, for the Russia webinar, if it's
it's the 1st of April, Macmillan Russia website.
I'll try and get on with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically, in a nutshell, it's brand new material. All the texts are brand new, up to date. And actually, I didn't realize at the time, but all of the texts really have all of those things that we're all talking about at the moment: sustainable shopping, ethical shopping, all sorts of sort of things that are in the news at the moment. So all the texts are brand new. We've also we've modified the life skills to become two things: thinking skills and social and emotional learning. Really, so that I think when you're teaching the same book for a while, even though you may love it, it's quite nice to have something that's a little bit fresh, that's a little bit new and up to date. The format of Gateway is more or less the same as always, with lots of new added things, including completely new flipped classroom videos, including also really nice national documentary videos that we're using on those thinking skills pages. So I think, I think we use the expression tried and tested. In other words, if you've used Gateway before and you enjoy using it, well, you said sort of, there's just more of everything, and it's up to date, and it's all new and it's all very fresh. Like I say, particularly the learning, the thinking skills, and also I mentioned these projects, which could be really interesting. Again, this idea of the virtual classroom exchange of the collaborative projects, which you don't have to share, but if you feel like sharing, you can share them with the world. Okay, so I mean, hopefully people will get a chance to check it out. Yeah, there's the link there, but have a look at it. And I see that some people have seen it and think that it looks nice. Oh, well, that's the other thing as well. Of course, all of the digital side is completely refreshed and even better. And we've got this app as well, which has got gamification. So, particularly in this day and age where we need to be up to date with all the online teaching as well, then it basically has everything that you would possibly need. As it says, they're fully flexible.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Dave.